The studio lights blazed, reflecting off the sleek glass table as the countdown to live broadcast began. Millions of viewers tuned in, expecting another routine political debate, but what they were about to witness would be far from ordinary. The American Spotlight, one of the nation's most watched political talk shows, was about to host a discussion on media bias, a topic that had fueled heated debates across the country. Seated at the table was James Calloway, a veteran TV host with decades of experience, a man known for his sharp questioning, unshakable confidence, and no-nonsense style. Opposite him sat Karoline Leavitt, a rising star in conservative politics, a former White House press secretary, and a figure who had quickly become one of the most formidable voices of her generation. The contrast between them was striking. Calloway, the seasoned gatekeeper of mainstream journalism, and Leavitt, the young conservative firebrand challenging the very institution he represented. As the show's signature theme music played, signaling the start of another night of debate, tension crackled in the air. Calloway wore his usual confident smirk as he shuffled his notes, his gaze sharp and assessing. Leavitt, poised and composed, met his stare with unwavering confidence, fully aware that she was stepping into hostile territory. The topic of the night was simple, yet loaded with implications. Is the media truly fair? What seemed like an ordinary question masked years of deep political division, distrust, and accusations of bias that had long defined the American media landscape. Calloway opened the discussion smoothly, addressing the audience with practiced ease. "Good evening and welcome to American Spotlight," he began, his voice steady, authoritative. "Tonight, we tackle a question at the heart of our democracy. Does the media still serve the people, or has it become just another political tool?" He turned to Leavitt with a thin smile. "Karoline, thank you for joining us tonight. I know our audience is eager to hear your perspective." Leavitt returned his smile, her tone polite but firm. "Thank you, James. I look forward to an open and honest discussion. This is an important issue, especially in an era where information spreads faster than ever before." Calloway nodded, though there was a hint of challenge in his expression. "You're absolutely right. Information moves at lightning speed, which forces us to ask a bigger question. Is the media truly objective? Or are people just looking for bias where none exists?" Leavitt didn't blink. She knew this game well. "I believe the media should serve as a mirror to the truth, neutral and unbiased. But we've all seen how certain stories are elevated while others are buried, even when their significance is the same." Calloway smirked slightly, as if he had been waiting for that exact response. "Are you implying there is a systematic bias in the media?" Leavitt's expression didn't change. "At this point, it's not an implication, it's a reality." The conversation was moving fast, each question and response sharpening the divide between them. Behind the scenes, producers in the control room watched intently, sensing that the discussion was escalating in a way they hadn't expected. No one in the studio, not the crew, not the audience, and certainly not Calloway or Leavitt, knew that within minutes, this debate would take a turn so explosive that it would shake the entire network. James Calloway had built his career on being unshakable. He had spent decades grilling politicians, CEOs, and public figures, exposing contradictions, dismantling weak arguments, and maintaining absolute control over every interview. But tonight, as the conversation with Karoline Leavitt intensified, something was different. Leavitt wasn't like the guests he was used to dealing with. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't defensive, and she certainly wasn't intimidated. Instead, she was composed, sharp, and prepared for every line of attack. No matter how Calloway tried to corner her, she met him with the same level of intensity, countering every argument with one of her own. For the first time in a long time, Calloway felt himself losing control of the conversation. The shift was subtle at first, a slight tightening of his jaw, a sharper tone in his voice, an extra second spent trying to find his next move. But Karoline saw it, and so did the audience. The discussion had started as a measured debate, but as it progressed, it became clear that this wasn't just an exchange of ideas. It was a battle for dominance. Calloway, who had spent years setting the rules, found himself being challenged in a way that was both unexpected and frustrating. Leavitt wasn't just answering his questions, she was turning them back on him, exposing the flaws in his framing and pushing back against the very foundation of his arguments. He asked if conservatives were simply searching for bias that wasn't there, and she responded by pointing out specific instances where major news networks had suppressed or amplified stories based on political agendas. He claimed conservative media was just as biased, and she countered by saying the difference was that mainstream media pretended to be neutral while still pushing an agenda. Every time Calloway tried to regain control, Leavitt remained steady, her confidence only growing. And then it happened. Under the weight of the conversation, Calloway made a mistake, one that would cost him everything. His frustration boiled over, and rather than sticking to the debate, he let emotion seep into his words. His voice, usually so measured and authoritative, took on a harder edge. Leaning slightly forward, he said the words that would become the defining moment of his career. Maybe if conservatives spent less time complaining about being oppressed and more time actually contributing to society, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The second the words left his mouth, the entire studio froze. There was no sound, no movement, just silence. Even Calloway himself seemed to realize what he had just said, his expression shifting slightly as if he wanted to take it back. But it was too late. The damage was done. In the control room, producers exchanged stunned glances, their eyes wide as they processed what had just happened. Viewers at home held their breath, waiting for the reaction. But Leavitt? She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't react with outrage. Instead, she simply tilted her head slightly and asked, with perfect calmness, "Would you like to clarify what you mean by that?" That was it. That single question turned Calloway's mistake into an inescapable trap. If he doubled down, he would make it worse. If he tried to backtrack, it would be seen as weakness. There was no way out. The internet wasted no time. Within minutes, the clip was already circulating on social media, being clipped, edited, and reposted with captions like, "Calloway expose his own bias," and "Liberal host finally says the quiet part out loud." Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube were flooded with reaction videos, political commentators dissecting the moment frame by frame. Hashtags like, "Fire James Calloway," and "Media bias exposed" trended instantly. But what made the moment even more powerful wasn't just what Calloway said, it was Leavitt's response. She didn't attack. She didn't escalate. She simply let his own words hang in the air, letting the audience come to their own conclusions. And that was more devastating than anything she could have said. By the time the show ended, the damage was already spiraling out of control. Sponsors began contacting the network, demanding explanations. Inside the studio, executives scrambled to figure out how to contain the fallout. But deep down, everyone knew there was no saving Calloway from this. His entire career had just collapsed in real time, and the world was watching. The moment James Calloway uttered his now infamous remark, the balance of power in the debate shifted entirely. What had started as a tense but measured exchange had suddenly turned into a defining moment, one that would determine the fate of one of the most well-known liberal hosts in mainstream media. But in that crucial second, it wasn't Calloway's words alone that sealed his downfall. It was Karoline Leavitt's response. She didn't flinch, she didn't interrupt, and she didn't lash out. Instead, she did something far more devastating. She paused. Silence at times can be the most powerful weapon in a debate, and Leavitt knew exactly how to wield it. She allowed the weight of Calloway's words to hang in the air, letting the audience, both in the studio and watching at home, absorb their full meaning. Producers in the control room exchanged nervous glances, recognizing that something seismic had just happened. Some leaned closer to their monitors, waiting for her reaction, but Leavitt remained completely composed. She didn't need to show shock or anger. She knew Calloway had already lost. Then, with a slight tilt of her head and a calm, measured voice, she asked the single most damaging question possible. "Would you like to clarify what you mean by that?" It was the perfect counterstrike. She hadn't accused him of anything directly, hadn't attacked his credibility outright. She had given him a chance to save himself, knowing full well that he couldn't. In that moment, Calloway was trapped. He had two options: either double down and reinforce what many were already interpreting as an elitist and dismissive remark, or backtrack and appear weak, undermining his own authority. For the first time in the entire debate, James Calloway hesitated. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but then closed it again, his mind scrambling for a way out. The silence stretched, growing more unbearable with each passing second. The tension in the studio was suffocating. Even the audience, many of whom had tuned in expecting Calloway to dominate, seemed to shift in their seats. They knew he had made a mistake, and more importantly, they knew he knew it too. Finally, after a noticeable pause, Calloway forced a chuckle, attempting to regain his footing. "I simply meant that conservatives often push the narrative that they're being silenced when in reality they have a lot of influence." But the damage was done. His voice lacked the confidence and control he had exuded earlier. The audience wasn't convinced, and neither was Leavitt. She didn't press him further. She didn't need to. Instead, she let his own words hang in the air, allowing the audience to form their own conclusions. She simply nodded, folded her hands on the table, and continued watching him, her silence more cutting than any rebuttal could have been. She had won the exchange without needing to say another word. In the control room, producers knew the network was in trouble. Clips of the moment were already being edited and posted on social media, each one emphasizing how Leavitt had calmly dismantled a veteran host without even raising her voice. The reaction online was immediate. Conservative media outlets seized the moment, branding Calloway as a symbol of mainstream media arrogance and bias, while independent commentators praised Leavitt for her composure. The narrative had been set, and now all that was left was to watch the fallout unfold. The moment James Calloway's words left his mouth, the internet took over. Within minutes, clips of the exchange between him and Karoline Leavitt flooded social media. On Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok, users wasted no time breaking down every second of the now infamous moment. The phrase, "maybe if conservatives spent less time complaining and more time contributing," was ripped from the live broadcast and turned into the headline of the night. Conservative influencers, right-wing media figures, and everyday users pounced on the moment, calling it proof of what they had been saying for years. Mainstream media was biased, condescending, and dismissive of conservative voices. The hashtag #FireJamesCalloway started trending almost immediately, with tweets demanding accountability. One viral post read, "Imagine if a conservative host said this about any other group of people. They'd be fired before the show even ended. This is what media bias looks like." Another wrote, "James Calloway just said what the media has always thought. If you're conservative, your voice doesn't matter." The engagement numbers skyrocketed, with millions of views, retweets, and comments. Within hours, the clip had spread beyond political circles. It was everywhere. Meanwhile, on the left, defenses of Calloway were mixed. Some progressive voices tried to downplay the controversy, arguing that the outrage was an overreaction. A few journalists tweeted in his defense, claiming he was making a point about conservative victimhood, not insulting all conservatives. However, this defense failed to gain traction. The problem wasn't just what Calloway said, it was how he said it, the dismissive tone, the implication that conservative Americans were not contributing to society. Even neutral viewers felt uncomfortable. Some independent commentators admitted that, while they didn't agree with Leavitt's politics, her composure and strategic silence had made Calloway look arrogant and out of touch. As the backlash intensified, the damage extended beyond Twitter discourse. YouTube was flooded with reaction videos, with conservative influencers dissecting the moment frame by frame. Fox News, The Daily Wire, and Newsmax ran segments that night, looping the clip and labeling Calloway's remarks as the epitome of media elitism. Tucker Carlson declared, "They don't even hide it anymore. This is what they think of you." Ben Shapiro broke it down, saying, "Calloway's mistake wasn't just what he said, it's that he actually let the mask slip." Glenn Beck called it media suicide. But what truly escalated the crisis was what happened behind the scenes at Calloway's network. Sponsors were watching, and they weren't happy. Initially, a few companies paused their advertisements, issuing cautious statements about reviewing the situation. But by the next morning, the real panic set in. At least 4 major sponsors had announced that they were pulling their funding. A well-known corporate advertiser issued a statement, "We take our commitment to neutrality and inclusivity in media very seriously." We are suspending all ad placements on American Spotlight until further review. The network's executives went into crisis mode. Inside the newsroom, emergency meetings were being held every hour. Producers were frantically monitoring the fallout, trying to assess the scale of the damage. A senior PR executive sighed as they scrolled through Twitter, shaking their head. "This is bad, really bad." Another executive leaned forward in frustration. "We can't afford to lose more sponsors over this. We need to act fast." Calloway himself was silent, no doubt feeling the weight of what was happening. His decades-long career, built on commanding debates and holding others accountable, was now unraveling in real time. In the past, controversies had come and gone, but this one felt different. The speed at which the backlash had grown, the corporate reaction, the sheer number of headlines, there was no walking this one back. As the internet continued to churn out memes, reaction clips, and political commentary, it became clear that this wasn't just a bad moment for Calloway. It was a full-blown media crisis. He wasn't just losing an argument, he was losing everything. Inside the headquarters of Calloway's network, panic had reached its peak. The backlash against him wasn't just a fleeting controversy, it was a full-scale disaster, and executives knew it. What had started as a heated debate had spiraled into a national scandal, threatening to bring down not just Calloway but also the credibility of the network itself. The sponsors were pulling out, the viewership backlash was growing, and most importantly, Calloway had become a liability rather than an asset. By early morning, emergency meetings were taking place at every level of the network. Executives debated the best course of action. Could Calloway survive this storm, or was the only way to protect the brand to cut ties? A PR executive sighed, scrolling through trending hashtags. "Fire James." Calloway was still the #1 trend on Twitter, and major news outlets, not just conservative ones but mainstream ones as well, were covering the fallout. He looked up from his phone. This isn't going away. Calloway's decades-long career was collapsing in real time, and the more the network waited, the more the outrage built. The tipping point came when a second wave of sponsors officially announced their withdrawal from his show. One statement read, "We cannot in good conscience continue to support a program where the host makes divisive and inflammatory remarks. We are ending our partnership effective immediately." The moment that announcement was made, the decision was clear. Calloway had to go. At 10 a.m., the final meeting took place. It was short, tense, and inevitable. One executive put it bluntly, "We can't defend this. If we try to wait it out, we risk losing more than just Calloway. We risk losing the entire show." Another, who had worked with Calloway for years, hesitated. "But are we really going to let the internet decide his fate? One mistake and his entire career is over?" A senior PR strategist responded with cold realism. "This isn't about fairness. It's about survival. He's toxic now. The longer we wait, the worse it gets." The CEO finally spoke. "Make the announcement." By 3 p.m., the network issued its official statement. "After careful review of recent events, we have decided to part ways with James Calloway, effective immediately. We thank him for his years of service and wish him the best in his future endeavors." No apology, no justification, a clean break. As soon as the statement hit the internet, reactions were immediate and divided. On one side, people celebrated his downfall, calling it justice. A TV host can't just say things like that without consequences. Good riddance. Others saw it as another example of cancel culture run amok. This is why free speech is dead. One sentence and they erase a man's entire career. Meanwhile, James Calloway himself had gone silent. No public statement, no media appearances. He had disappeared from the airwaves he once dominated, and for the first time in decades, he was no longer the one controlling the narrative. But the story wasn't over. Because when a man like Calloway loses everything, he doesn't just fade away, he fights back. And in the shadows of his downfall, he was already planning his next move. The moment James Calloway's firing was announced, the reaction was swift, polarized, and fierce. Across the political spectrum, battle lines were drawn, with conservatives celebrating what they saw as long overdue accountability for mainstream media elitism, while liberals rushed to his defense, arguing that this was yet another example of cancel culture spiraling out of control. What had started as a single debate had now transformed into a larger cultural war, one that extended far beyond Calloway himself. On the right-wing media circuit, Calloway's downfall was hailed as a victory against media hypocrisy. Fox News ran segments on it almost immediately, with Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, and Laura Ingraham all discussing the significance of what had happened. Carlson, in his signature deadpan tone, declared, "For years they've called us conspiracy theorists for pointing out media bias. Well, James Calloway just proved us right in real time." Hannity was even more direct. "They think they can talk down to half of America and get away with it. Not anymore. The people are fighting back." The Daily Wire, Newsmax, and Breitbart all ran articles dissecting the controversy, each framing it as yet another example of why mainstream media was crumbling under its own arrogance. Conservative influencers on social media capitalized on the moment, with thousands of tweets and posts celebrating Karoline Leavitt's calm, strategic handling of the debate. One viral post read, "James Calloway got taken down without Karoline even raising her voice. That's what happens when you let facts speak for themselves." Another conservative commentator tweeted, "Leavitt didn't just win that debate, she exposed the rot at the core of corporate media." At Trump rallies, the incident quickly became a rallying cry. During a speech in Florida, Trump himself addressed the controversy. "Did you see what happened to that guy Calloway? He thought he was so smart, thought he could insult millions of hardworking Americans, and boom, he's gone. That's what happens when you go up against the truth." The crowd erupted in cheers. The narrative was set. Calloway had been exposed, his career was over, and conservatives had won a major battle in the war against mainstream media bias. But on the left, the reaction was far different. Liberal commentators and mainstream news outlets rushed to Calloway's defense, framing his firing as an overreaction fueled by internet outrage. MSNBC, The New York Times, and The Washington Post all published pieces questioning whether Calloway had truly deserved to lose his career over one comment. A journalist for The Atlantic argued, "We have entered an era where a single misstep can erase decades of work. This should concern all of us, no matter our politics." Others accused conservatives of hypocrisy, pointing out that right-wing media had defended controversial conservative figures in the past, while now cheering on Calloway's downfall. Social media was equally divided. The hashtag #FireJamesCalloway was still trending, but now it was being countered by Stand With Calloway, with some users arguing that his words had been taken out of context. One viral tweet read, "This isn't about justice. This is about punishing a man for daring to challenge conservative narratives." Another user wrote, "If we fire every journalist who says something controversial, who's left to speak?" In the end, the debate wasn't just about whether Calloway deserved to be fired. It was about what this moment signified. To conservatives, it was proof that mainstream media was finally facing consequences for its biases. To liberals, it was a dangerous precedent, showing that no one was safe from cancellation. And for the public watching it all unfold, it was yet another sign that America's media landscape was more divided than ever before. As the fallout from James Calloway's firing dominated headlines, one thing became undeniable. Karoline Leavitt was no longer just another conservative voice. She was now a rising political force. What had started as a simple television debate had catapulted her into national prominence, making her one of the most talked-about figures in conservative media. Unlike Calloway, who had lost everything in the wake of his remarks, Leavitt had gained something far more valuable: credibility, influence, and the admiration of an entire movement. While Calloway's career was crumbling, Leavitt's star was rising faster than anyone had anticipated. Conservative networks, talk radio hosts, and political influencers couldn't stop praising her performance, calling it a masterclass in poise, intelligence, and strategic restraint. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to resort to theatrics. She had let Calloway defeat himself, and that alone had made her an icon of conservative resilience. Fox News invited her back within 24 hours. And this time, it wasn't just as a guest. It was as a headline figure. She appeared on Hannity, The Ingraham Angle, and Tucker Carlson Tonight, where she was introduced not just as a commentator, but as the woman who exposed James Calloway. Each interview reinforced the same message. She had walked into CNN's territory, stood her ground, and left victorious. Beyond television, her social media exploded. In a matter of days, her Twitter following doubled, her Instagram was flooded with messages of support, and her name was trending across conservative platforms. Influential political figures began publicly endorsing her, with members of Congress and leading conservative activists calling her the future of the movement. The Republican National Committee, RNC, took notice, and within a week, Leavitt had received invitations to speak at high-profile conservative conferences, including CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference, and Turning Point USA events. She wasn't just a commentator anymore, she was now a political force to be reckoned with. Even within the Trump campaign, strategists recognized her value. Calls were made, meetings were arranged, and soon enough, she was in discussions about playing a bigger role in shaping the 2024 election media strategy. What had started as a single debate had now secured her a place in national politics. And yet, through it all, Leavitt remained silent about Callaway's downfall. She didn't gloat, she didn't celebrate, she simply continued doing what she did best, staying composed, staying focused, and letting her success speak for itself. In the world of politics and media, some figures fade after their 15 minutes of fame. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't fading. She was just getting started. As James Callaway sat in his home, watching the world react to his downfall, he knew one thing for certain. His time in mainstream media was over. The network had severed ties with him, his name was being wiped from promotional materials, and former colleagues were distancing themselves as fast as possible. For the first time in decades, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. He had been silenced, erased. But Callaway wasn't the type to disappear quietly. If the network thought he was going to fade into obscurity, they were wrong. 3 days after his firing, he broke his silence. A cryptic tweet appeared on his official account. "The truth cannot be silenced, we're just getting started." Below it was a link to a brand new website, The Callaway Report. Those who clicked found a simple but striking video. Callaway, sitting in a dimly lit home office, staring directly into the camera. There was no network backdrop, no professional studio, just him and a microphone. His voice was steady, but the weight of recent events was unmistakable. "I lost my job over a single sentence," he began. "But this isn't just about me. This is about who controls the narrative, who decides who gets to speak and who gets silenced. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." It was a declaration of war, not just against the network that fired him, but against the entire mainstream media establishment. Callaway framed himself as a casualty of political censorship, someone who had been punished for speaking the truth, rather than conforming to the agenda of corporate-controlled journalism. He wasn't just launching a new platform, he was launching a movement. The response was immediate. Within hours, his website had received hundreds of thousands of visits. His video was shared by right-wing influencers, who now saw him as a martyr for free speech. Conservative talk radio hosts picked up the story, framing Callaway as a man who had been destroyed by cancel culture but was now rising from the ashes. The phrase, "Callaway uncancelled," started trending. His former employers tried to distance themselves further, issuing another statement, insisting that Callaway's firing had nothing to do with free speech, but rather with ensuring journalistic integrity. But the damage was already done. His name had become a symbol, and now, instead of being just another fired journalist, he was the voice of those who felt silenced by the establishment. Within a week, the Callaway Report was gaining traction, drawing in disillusioned viewers who no longer trusted mainstream outlets. Whether he was doing it out of personal revenge or genuine belief in his cause no longer mattered. Callaway had transformed himself from a disgraced host into a new kind of media figure. His former network may have ended his career on television, but in doing so, they had created something even more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose, and a platform of his own. The fallout from James Callaway's firing didn't just mark the end of his career in mainstream media. It signaled a much larger shift in the balance of power within the media landscape. For years, traditional news networks had dominated public discourse, acting as the gatekeepers of information. But this controversy exposed a truth that had been building for a long time. They were no longer in control. The rise of independent platforms, social media influencers, and alternative news sources had already been challenging the dominance of legacy media, and Calloway's downfall accelerated that transformation. His firing wasn't just about him. It became a symbol of why millions of Americans no longer trusted mainstream outlets and were turning to independent voices for news and analysis. Even before Calloway launched the Calloway Report, there was a noticeable shift happening across political and media circles. The debate surrounding his firing didn't just stay within conservative media. It spread across mainstream platforms, podcasts, and online discussions, sparking larger questions about who controls the narrative. To conservatives, this was the ultimate confirmation that mainstream media had become nothing more than an ideological machine, punishing anyone who dared to step out of line. To moderates and even some liberals, it was a troubling sign of how quickly public figures could be erased over a single moment of controversy. And to independent journalists, it was proof that corporate-controlled media was collapsing under the weight of its own bias. The Calloway controversy also highlighted the power of the internet in shaping public opinion. Just a decade ago, a fired television host might have struggled to rebuild their reputation. But today, with platforms like YouTube, Rumble, Substack, and Twitter Spaces, Calloway wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. His firing had given him a new level of influence, and now he was reaching audiences without the filter of corporate oversight. He was no longer beholden to executives, advertisers, or network policies. He could say whatever he wanted, however he wanted, and people were listening. At the same time, Karoline Leavitt's rise proved that young conservative voices no longer needed mainstream media approval to become influential. She had entered the debate as a guest but walked away as one of the most recognizable conservative figures in the country. Her viral moment, combined with her strategic silence following Calloway's downfall, cemented her as a serious political force. She hadn't just won a debate. She had exposed the cracks in the mainstream media's authority. Even inside major news networks, executives were forced to acknowledge the changing reality. Internal discussions were taking place. How could they regain the trust of their audience? How could they prevent another Calloway situation? Some believed the answer was doubling down on editorial control, while others argued that networks needed to embrace more transparency and balance before they lost their relevance entirely. Regardless of their approach, one thing was clear. The media world was shifting, and those who refused to adapt would be left behind. The Calloway scandal wasn't just another TV controversy. It was a turning point in the war between corporate media and independent voices. And as the dust settled, one undeniable truth remained. The audience, not the networks, now decided who had the power to speak. The controversy surrounding James Calloway's firing and Karoline Leavitt's rise wasn't just about one man's downfall or one woman's success. It was about something far bigger. It was about how media narratives are shaped, who controls them, and what happens when that control slips away. It revealed deep fractures in the modern media landscape, highlighting how trust in mainstream outlets had eroded and how independent voices were now leading the national conversation. But beyond politics and media battles, this moment exposed a bigger cultural shift, one that should make everyone, regardless of political affiliation, stop and think. First, it reinforced the dangers of outrage culture. In today's hyper-connected world, one sentence, one moment of lost composure can end an entire career. Calloway had spent decades as a respected journalist, but in a matter of hours he went from a household name to a cautionary tale. His words, whether intentional or not, were amplified, dissected, and weaponized against him. Social media didn't just report on the controversy, it drove it, shaped it, and ultimately determined its outcome. The internet's ability to take one soundbite, strip it of context, and turn it into a viral moment of condemnation has created an environment where public figures are no longer judged by their entire body of work, but by their worst, most vulnerable moment. The question remains, is that accountability, or is it a dangerous new form of mob justice? Second, this controversy exposed how traditional media no longer holds the same power it once did. For years, networks like Calloway's controlled the national conversation. They decided what stories were important, what voices were amplified, and what narratives were pushed. But that era is ending. With the rise of independent platforms, social media influences, and decentralized news sources, audiences now have more choices than ever before. They don't need to rely on corporate media to tell them what to think. They can seek out alternative perspectives, form their own opinions, and challenge the mainstream narrative in real time. Calloway's firing didn't silence him. It gave him a new platform, a new audience, and a new mission. That alone speaks volumes about how power has shifted from institutions to individuals. Third, and perhaps most importantly, this moment showed that winning in the media battle isn't always about speaking the loudest. It's about strategy, composure, and timing. Karoline Leavitt didn't destroy Calloway by yelling, insulting him, or making dramatic accusations. She won because she stayed calm, asked the right question, and let him destroy himself. In an age where debates are often shouting matches, viral outbursts, and emotional reactions, Leavitt proved that sometimes the most powerful response is silence. Her ability to remain composed while Calloway unraveled was a masterclass in media strategy, and it's why she walked away from the controversy stronger than ever. At its core, this controversy wasn't just about media bias, political division, or cancel culture. It was about power, who holds it, and how quickly it can be taken away. The real lesson? In today's world, truth is no longer dictated from the top down. It's fought for, debated, and decided by the people. And whether that's a good thing or a dangerous one, only time will tell. The controversy surrounding James Calloway's downfall and Karoline Leavitt's rise offers profound lessons that go far beyond politics or media bias. It speaks to the changing nature of influence, the power of words, and the way society reacts to controversy. For older generations who have witnessed the evolution of journalism, the rise of television, and now the explosion of digital media, this moment is a reminder that we are living in an era where the speed of information is both a tool and a weapon. One key takeaway is the importance of measured speech and thoughtful communication. Calloway spent decades as a respected journalist, yet one sentence, spoken in frustration, cost him everything. This is not just about politics. It's about how quickly public perception can shift. In life, whether in a personal conversation, a workplace discussion, or a family disagreement, words have power. A single moment of thoughtlessness can have lasting consequences. And in today's world, where social media amplifies everything, it is more important than ever to think before we speak. For older generations who have always valued respectful debate, patience, and wisdom, this reinforces a simple but timeless truth: composure matters. Another lesson is how easily narratives are shaped, controlled, and sometimes distorted by the media. Many older adults remember a time when the evening news was trusted as a reliable source of truth. But today, with so many voices, platforms, and agendas, it has become harder than ever to know what is real and what is manipulated. This controversy shows that one moment, taken out of context, can define a person's entire career. It reminds us to be cautious, not to believe everything we see at first glance, to seek multiple perspectives, and to always question how and why a story is being told. Perhaps the most important lesson is how power has shifted from institutions to individuals. Decades ago, major news networks controlled public discourse. Now, a single person with a phone and an internet connection can change the national conversation. This can be both a good and a bad thing. On one hand, it allows for more voices to be heard. On the other, it creates a world where outrage moves faster than understanding. For older generations who have lived through times of great societal change, this is a moment to reflect on what kind of discourse we want to leave behind. Are we fostering a culture of open discussion, patience, and wisdom? Or are we feeding into a system where people are judged instantly and harshly, without room for growth or redemption? In the end, this event is a reminder to be mindful, to seek the full picture before reacting, and to remember that in a world where everything moves quickly, wisdom still comes from thinking deeply and acting with care.